Welcome to the award-winning Thoughts from a Page podcast, a member of the Evergreen Podcasts Network, hosted by me, Cindy Burnett, a voracious reader and book columnist who provides you with engaging author conversations and book recommendation episodes, as well as insider information on all of the newest releases that I personally endorse and on the publishing industry in my behind-the-scenes series. With so many books coming out weekly, it can be hard to decide what to read, so I find the best ones and share them with you. For more book recommendations and to find my backlist of interviews, visit my website at thoughtsfromapage.com. If you are interested in accessing unique bonus content, I hope you will consider joining my Patreon group. I offer 2 levels: Page Turners, which includes my popular Early Reads program, where patrons have access to monthly early digital reads through NetGalley and exclusive pre-publication author chats, as well as regular bonus episodes and fun surprise content. My second level is Lit Lovers, which includes all of the Page Turner benefits, as well as my Traveling Galley program, where patrons can read at least 3 to 4 new titles a month that are in print galley form and are passed along to other members. One of July's selections is the new William Kent Kruger book, The River We Remember. In addition, there are 2 monthly episodes, fiction-nonfiction pairings, and spoiler-filled interviews with 3 authors. The link to join is in my show notes. Today, I am chatting with Pip Williams about her fabulous new book, The Bookbinder. Pip was born in London, grew up in Sydney, and now lives in Australia's Adelaide Hills. Her debut novel, The Dictionary of Lost Words, was a New York Times bestseller and a Reese's Book Club pick. I hope you enjoy our conversation. And now for a quick break. For the last year, I have been focusing more on my health and eating habits. In connection with that, I have started drinking AG1 in the morning. When I started drinking AG1 daily, I could feel a real difference in my health and energy levels. That is because AG1 is a foundational nutrition supplement that supports your body's universal needs like gut optimization, stress management, and immune support. Since 2010, AG1 has led the future of foundational nutrition, continuously refining their formula to create a smarter, better way to elevate your baseline health. I recommend AG1 to all of my family and friends because the company has a team of doctors and scientists. It is tested for 950 contaminants and is NSF certified for sport. It is formulated based on the latest science, and it maintains high-quality standards. Thanks, AG1, for sponsoring my show. AG1 is a supplement I trust to provide the support my body needs daily. If you want to take ownership of your health, it starts with AG1. Try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D3K2 and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first purchase. Go to drinkag1.com/thoughtsfromapage. That's drinkag1.com/thoughtsfromapage. Check it out. And now back to my show. Welcome, Pip. How are you today?
I'm very well, Cindy. How are you?
I'm very well as well, and I'm thrilled to pieces that we are getting to talk because I absolutely loved the Bookbinder, and I have so many questions for you.
Oh, thank you. And it's just such a pleasure to be here.
Well, and this is kind of fun because you're in Australia and I'm in Texas, so we had to find a time that worked for both of us. So for me, it's 7 p.m., and for you, it's 9:30 in the morning, correct?
That's right. And it's a beautiful sunny day in Adelaide, but it probably won't be as warm here as it is where you are.
It has been so warm this summer, the warmest I can ever remember. So yes, sadly, it is awfully hot here.
Yeah, no, we're in the middle of winter, which is still quite nice. It's about 17 degrees Celsius here today, so not bad for winter.
Well, and you mentioned being on the other side of the planet and below the equator, so that we're on total flip sides. I was so interested with respect to that your book has already come out too, talking about things that are different. So here, your book comes out in August, but it came out in March. Is that correct in Australia?
Yeah, that's right. It came out at the very end of March, and I've been touring with it around Australia since then.
That's what I was going to ask you next was, have you been touring? So how is that going?
Oh, look, it's just wonderful because I'm not sure that you know, but my first novel, The Dictionary of Lost Words, came out 2 days after the whole world went into lockdown. So I didn't get to tour with that book at all. In fact, I didn't meet a single reader for maybe 18 months. And so this is a very different experience. You know, the first experience was just Zooming all the time. We all got used to Zoom. But this time, yeah, I've been on planes, I've been on buses, I've been on, trains and in cars, going to libraries and festivals and all sorts of wonderful bookshop events. And it's just been really wonderful to speak to readers. So I've loved it.
That has to be doubly exciting since it wasn't very exciting for your first one to have to be online all the time.
Yeah, that's true. But the benefits, I suppose, of the first one, you have to find silver linings, don't you, with the whole COVID experience. And the silver lining for me, I suppose, is that I did get to write the Bookbinder. And I really don't think I would have finished it, at least, if not for COVID. So because I wasn't travelling around, I had all of that, the luxury of time just to spend in this book.
That's a very good point. And I think the other silver lining is that we all learned all of these online platforms, and you probably reached a lot more readers worldwide than you would have potentially if we hadn't had COVID.
Actually, yeah, you're so right, Cindy. So what happened, my book came out, and this was my first, so this is the Dictionary of Lost Words. It was my first novel. So I was an unknown author. The book came out, as I said, 2 days after we all went into lockdown. And then bookshops and online book groups and so on did this wonderful thing, this pivot. I love that new word that came up during COVID. They pivoted to online events. And because my book had just come out, suddenly it was popular with online events in those first 2, 3, 4 weeks. So I had 250 people turn up to my first event about a week after the book had come out. And if I'd done that face-to-face in my local library, I would have had 20 people turn up, and all of them would have been related to me or good friends. So there was something wonderful about the reach, actually, of online events, because it meant a lot of people who sometimes can't actually even get out to a physical event, maybe because they don't want to go out at night, or they can't drive, or they have a disability, or for whatever reason, they have children they can't leave. They could actually jump online and be part of these events in a way that they couldn't before. So you're right. I think the book actually did sort of meet more people in the digital world than it might have in the real life world.
I think that's definitely one of the positive things about COVID, because like you said, you have to have silver linings. So one of the silver linings was that we were able to learn all of these online platforms, reach more people, engage with authors, engage with each other, because I can't even imagine if that hadn't been there while we were all sitting at home. So that is wonderful. And then you had such exciting news about that book, because it was then subsequently picked by Reese for her book club.
I know. This was just so out of the blue. And I have to admit to you, there's so many good things have happened with that first book that I feel a bit sheepish picking a favourite. But I have to admit that finding out that Reese's book club had chosen my book for its May 2021 book really was the most exciting thing ever, because it wasn't something I expected. It wasn't something that I don't think you can even try to make it happen. It just happens. And so it wasn't something I'd even dreamed of or anticipated or worked towards. And I just got this email, and I have to admit, I originally thought maybe it was some sort of scam.
A prank.
Yeah. But it wasn't. And it was so exciting. Also because it was the first Australian book to be chosen for her book club, which was a huge deal here. Even though she's supported Australian writers in the past in terms of producing films and so on, she hadn't actually chosen an Australian book before. So that was really exciting as well. And it makes a huge difference to sales and to the number of people who get to find out about the book and read it, and if they like it, pass it on. So it was just wonderful.
The interesting thing to me, because I follow all of those clubs closely, was that your book had been out for a little bit when it was picked. And that really struck a chord with me, because you don't see that very often.
Yeah, you're right, actually. And earlier I just said it was May 2021, but actually it was May 2022. Again, this is a COVID leftover, isn't it? You just sort of lose track of time, because the book had been out for nearly a year, actually, in the US. And they timed the release of the paperback to coincide with Reese's book club. So that was, it was just fabulous. And again, another reason why it was so unexpected, I suppose, because the book had been out for a little while.
Definitely. Well, it had to be so exciting, and congratulations on that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Well, let's dive into the Bookbinder. What I usually do is ask an author to give me a quick synopsis for those that haven't read it yet.
Sure. So the Bookbinder is actually a companion to the Dictionary of Lost Words. And I say companion because it's not a prequel or a sequel. And in fact, you don't need to read the Dictionary of Lost Words to enjoy the Bookbinder. They're quite separate stories, but they do speak to each other. I kind of think of them in some ways as sister books. They hold hands and one will enrich the other, whichever order you read them in. And so the Bookbinder essentially is set during the war years, World War I, from 1914 to about 1920. And it's about a woman called Peggy, a young woman called Peggy, who works in the bookbindery of Oxford University Press during the war. And she and her identical twin sister Maud live on a narrow boat on the Oxford Canal. And every day they walk into Jericho, which is the name of the neighbourhood of Oxford, where Oxford University Press is. They walk into Jericho and walk into the press, and every morning she looks across the road to Somerville College, which is the Ladies' College of Oxford University, and she wishes that she was a student there. But of course she can't be. She left school at 12 and she's destined to work in the bindery, really, just like her mother did, just like her grandmother did, for the rest of her life. But war changes everything. And when war comes to Oxford and refugees come to Oxford, there are opportunities for women all over England, in fact, because the men leave and the women have to stay to keep the country running. And so Peggy starts to think that maybe she can follow this dream. But, you know, things don't always turn out the way you want them to.
And you have the most beautiful book trailer on your website where you talk all about the book. I watched it like 3 times today. It made me want to read the book all over again.
Thank you. And actually, that was a bit of serendipity because I was in Oxford last June 2022, to do the last bit of research for this book. And it was wonderful because we organised for someone to come and do a video of me while I was there. So I'm actually walking around the streets that my characters walk around, and I'm at Oxford University Press, and I have the university in the background and so on. So it was a wonderful thing to be able to do.
It was just lovely to watch it. Like I said, I kept watching it.
Although I have to admit, this is the behind the scenes section. I had just had a haircut, which I didn't love. So every time I see the video, I just see this haircut that I didn't love.
You're like, could I not have gotten my hair cut before I did this video?
I know. It's one of those moments that you just sort of think, why? But I know why, because I thought, I'll go into a hair salon and they'll blow dry my hair and make it all look wonderful. But, I'm constantly disappointed when I come out of hairdressers. So, yeah, I should have known better.
That's too funny. What I kept thinking while I was watching it is whenever I have to record myself, I have to take a million takes. Like it just takes me forever. So I was like, I wonder if she did this in 1 take or if it took 20 takes, because it's very well done.
Well, I had a professional doing most of it.
That helps.
Except for the hair, the rest of the production values are quite good.
Well, how did you learn about these women at the Oxford University Press and then decide to write about them?
Yeah, so again, because I was in Oxford when I got the idea for the book, because I've been to Oxford a number of times now to do research for the 2 books. And when I was in Oxford in 2019 doing the last bit of research really for the first book, the Dictionary of Lost Words, I was in the archives. I wanted to know a little bit more about the women who bound the books, because there's a scene in the first book where a book is being bound. And so I asked the archivist for anything that he had that could tell me a little bit about the work that they did, the lives that they lived, all that sort of thing. And he brought all sorts of materials up to me, but really there was very little. There were a few photographs of women in the bindery folding the large sheets of paper that come off the press. And there was a beautiful black and white film that actually any of your listeners can look up online. I think it's on YouTube. It's called The Making of a Book at Oxford University Press, something like that. It was actually made in the 1920s, so it's quite close to the time that I was interested in. It's a black and white film, it's got like a soundtrack on the background. Beautiful black and white film. And it goes through every single process of making a book. And most of those processes are done by men, except for the folding of the pages and the gathering of the sections. And in this film, I saw a woman, beautifully dressed actually. She's even wearing slightly high heels, and she's moving along what's called the gathering bench. And the gathering bench was loaded up with sections from a book. And she moves along these sections and pulls them onto her arm until she's got an entire book. And the way she did it was so beautiful. She was almost dancing along this gathering bench. And I was so struck and taken by the image. But the first thing that popped into my head when I saw it was, I wonder if she ever stops to read what she's gathering into her arms. And I realized that because of the work she was doing, there would be this imperative to do it as fast as possible. And if she did stop to read, a supervisor would come along and tell her that her job is not to read the words, but to bind them. And this is where I got the idea for the Bookbinder. I suddenly had a character. I suddenly had a motivation for this character. And I had all sorts of obstacles, her gender, her class, the kind of job that she's doing. There were so many reasons why she wouldn't be allowed to read, even though that's all she wants to do.
I thought that was such an interesting part of the story, because as a reader and a lover of words, it would be so hard for me to do that job without constantly wanting to read what was on the page.
Yeah, and that's exactly why I had that thought, because, there I was in the archives reading as much as I possibly could. And suddenly I had an image of a real person doing her job in real time. And I suddenly knew that this woman, who in fact was in exactly the same place I was at that time, but at a different time in history. And I've only just thought of that, Cindy. It's kind of made me feel a little bit emotional, actually. It's the first time I've thought of it. I was in the same place that woman was when that film was taken, but 100 years later. And I was allowed to be reading all of those words that she might have wanted to read, because things have changed. And of course, I say that because things have changed for women like me, but things haven't changed for many women, which I think is also why the idea of a woman being denied access to knowledge was still, I suppose, so intriguing to me, because in fact, for some women, that hasn't changed. If we think of women in Afghanistan as the most extreme example, women and girls in Afghanistan still can't go to university or school at the moment. And so there are women around the world, and even in our own wealthy countries, women whose circumstances mean that they haven't got access to education, particularly tertiary education. And so some of the things that I was exploring in the book are current for a lot of people. But yeah, at the time, I just tried to imagine myself in that woman's shoes, her beautiful high-heeled shoes. and I wondered how I would feel if I was told my job was to bind the books but not read them.
It would be so difficult.
Yeah.
And you so vividly describe everything. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the other topics in the book in a minute. But I just felt like I was right there with the women as they were binding and everything that else that was happening. Like, you just really make it come alive. Is that something that you have to focus a lot on, or is that just the way you write?
I'd like to think it was the way I wrote, but no, I have to try hard to do that as well. I think I've always really loved being transported to another place when I read. So perhaps it's just my own sensibility, and that comes through in my writing. I do like to create, I suppose, spaces in the stories. So in this book, it is the bookbindery, but it's also particularly Calliope, which is the name of the narrowboat that Peggy and Maud live on. I really wanted readers to be able to inhabit that place and the detail of that place. And I tried to do the same with the scriptorium in the first book, which is where all the words for the dictionary are being defined. But thank you for saying that, because it is something that I try to achieve. And in trying to achieve it, I have to do a number of things. So I have to do my research, which is one of the pleasures of writing historical fiction, and particularly fiction which takes you away from your hometown. So I did have to travel to Oxford on a number of occasions. I had to live there, actually, so that I could walk the streets and smell the smells and see all of the wildlife that live along the canal, get a quality of light that might be there. And it's very different to where you live and where I live. The quality of light in Oxford is sort of a little more subdued than the big open blue skies of where we live. And so I did have to inhabit those places. But the other thing I needed to do for this book in particular was learn how to bind a book. Books aren't bound the way the characters in my book bind them anymore. So the first time someone might touch a book in our modern times, the first time Bookbinder, the book that you have of mine, the first time that was touched by anyone was probably the person who opened the box that came from the printers. They opened the box and they took the books out of the plastic that they're wrapped in. That's the first hand that probably touches it, because machines do everything now. But back in Peggy's day, 100 years ago, a book went through so many hands. It went through many hands within the bindery. It was touched by the men who worked the printing machines. It was sewn. It was beaten. The spine was glued and beaten. It was just touched by maybe 15 or 20 hands before it gets into the hand of the person who owns the book. And I loved this idea, but I needed to know what those processes felt like to do. And so I actually made friends with a bookbinder from the State Library of South Australia, and he had been an apprenticed bookbinder when he was 15. And at the time, the library had a men's side and a girls' side in the bindery, just like Oxford University Press. And there were more than 50 people working in the bindery at our state library at that time. And now there's just him. He's the only bookbinder left. And he was so generous with his time and spent a lot of time teaching me how to fold the pages, how to gather them, how to sew them. And actually, not long ago, he helped me bind my own book. So it's another little video that you can look online. You can just look up Pip Williams binds her own book. It's on YouTube. It goes for about 3 minutes. And I recommend it because it's just so beautiful, not because, I have to admit this, not because I did such a beautiful job, but because the videographer and Peter, who is my bookbinder friend, they just did such a marvellous job in helping me look good. So it was just so wonderful, but so essential to get it right. If I hadn't handled the pages myself, if I hadn't sewn them myself, I wouldn't know what it felt like for my characters. And anyone who is a bookbinder, and there are plenty of bookbinders out there these days, because it's a bit like baking sourdough bread. It's sort of become a craft that people have taken up for various reasons. And of course, there are still some professional bookbinders around, because old books always need repairing, and that's quite a skill. But a lot of people are learning to bind books. And so I had to get it right, because people will know if I've got it wrong.
Well, I can't wait to go check out that video. And that had to be so engrossing and just captivating to be holding a book in your hand that you yourself bound.
Oh, completely. It's also kind of scary, because I sort of feel like Peter was fantastic. I actually bound 7 copies of the book. And at one point he left to go and have lunch and left me to sew one of my books. And I just got a bit slack, and he came back and I hadn't done it quite right. And he made me undo it all and start again.
I was just going to say, did you have to undo it all? He's like, pull all those stitches out and start over, Pip.
I did. And he said, if you were a real bookbinder, this is what will happen. So even that, I even got the reprimand that my characters would have got from their supervisor had they sewn the book incorrectly.
Truly authentic.
Yeah, truly authentic. Yeah.
Well, the other thing, and you mentioned Calliope, which I felt you also very vividly depicted. The other thing was what it was like to be in Oxford when all of these men were leaving, what it was like for them to be gone, and what it was like for them to come back. And I felt that I have read a lot of World War I and a lot of World War II stories, but I hadn't really read something that resonated so much with me for what it was like for those people left behind. Obviously, the women were stepping in and doing different jobs, helping with various things. I don't want to spoil anything, but just that feeling of what it was like to be at home waiting, that has stuck with me since I finished your book.
Oh, thank you. It was something I was really interested in too. There are a lot of novels about World War I, but on the whole, they tend to focus on men's experience, which is completely understandable, or on the experience of women who are waiting for someone to come home. And I was really interested in the experience of women who are simply getting on with their lives, and they don't really have skin in the game, in that they don't have a father or a lover or a brother fighting at the front, someone who they're terribly anxious about and constantly waiting for. I didn't want this to be a story about waiting. I wanted it still to be a story about longing, but not waiting for someone to come home. And I wanted to explore the lives of women who needed to just get on with the job of living and working and keeping the country running, essentially. And the other thing I was interested in was refugees, because what happened during World War I is a lot of Belgian refugees arrived in England and in Oxford in particular. And I wanted to explore the experience of people who actually had to flee the war and end up in a country that wasn't their own. And so this story explores those things. And there is so much that still happens on the home front when a war is going on. I turned to all sorts of, not just research about the war, because it's hard to find information about the experience, particularly of working class women, but women in general. It's hard to find information about them because it wasn't considered that important to keep. So we often talk about women missing from history, women's experiences missing from history, but actually women's experiences are often also missing from the archives. So when me as a novelist or a historian or someone goes to look at the archives to try and tell a new story, we are sometimes confronted with many gaps. And so what I did was turn to women's art, because women made art during World War I. They wrote poetry, they wrote memoir, they wrote novels, and they painted, among other things. And so I turned to women's art to try and get a sense of what life was like during that time. And that was incredibly useful. But there was also gaps in that, because the women who make art were middle or upper class women who had time and also money to make art. It's that classic line from Virginia Woolf: a woman needs a room of her own and $700 a year if she wants to make art. And that's absolutely true. And working class women didn't have either. And so I had to extrapolate a little bit from what I found in the little I found in the archives, like that film I told you about and some photographs. I had to look at the women's art that I found. So Vera Britton's memoir, A Testament of Youth, also Virginia Woolf's diaries during World War I, and some visual art made by women, particularly an Australian woman called Isabel Ray, who was a VAD in France. I turned to that to get a sense of what life might have been like. And then I turned to sociology. But there were very few voices of working class women that I could find, though there were a few. And so I hope that I have kind of rendered an authentic story here with my Peggy and Maud.
Absolutely. And that's a very valid point, that they weren't waiting on anybody particularly themselves, but they were seeing how the town was impacted. So it wasn't so personal for them, but they could see different people at the bindery that were impacted when they lost a child or lost a spouse. It was just a different view than I felt like I had ever read. And it was so vivid. And I just really felt like I was dropped into the story.
Oh, thank you. And I think the other thing that it does, by not writing about someone who's waiting for someone to come home or grieving the loss of someone, what it allowed me to do is explore some of those possibilities that actually arise for women when there's a massive social upheaval like this. Because we're talking about a time in England when women still didn't have the right to vote. And there'd been a lot of debate and a lot of activism up until the beginning of the war. And in fact, there were many women in prison being force-fed at this time because of their suffragette activism. And when the war started, everything changed. So the suffragettes sort of stood back a bit, decided that they would not be so strident in their activism. They actually struck a deal with the government to back off in exchange for women being released from prison. And also the suffragettes were part of that white feather campaign, where they would humiliate young men into joining up and into fighting by pinning white feathers on their lapels if they weren't wearing a uniform. So in fact, many of these groups that, before the war were working against each other, during the war they started to work together. But war changed more than that. It created a whole lot of gaps in the workforce because so many men, as you said, they left the country to fight. And suddenly everybody realised that the country would fall apart if women weren't allowed to step up into men's jobs and do what the men had done. And so suddenly there were all these opportunities for women, just in terms of social opportunities, work opportunities, status opportunities. And I was interested to explore some of that and also to explore how it was different for working class women and women of means. And so that's where the story goes.
Well, without spoiling anything, Peggy has a friend who you use to do that. The two of them are on opposite ends of the class structure and are able to come together, but then learn more about what it's like to be the other person.
Yeah. And so Peggy's friend Gwen is a woman that she meets when she decides to volunteer in one of the many, many hospitals that sprung up in Oxford to treat returning soldiers. And it's one of those times where town and gown come together. So anyone who's listening who's been to Oxford, they might understand this term. There's a huge difference between town and gown in Oxford. Town are the people who live and work in Oxford, essentially, and gown are the people who are associated with the university. And this division between these two groups of people has been there for hundreds and hundreds of years, and it still exists. But it certainly existed 100 years ago. And often the only time town and gown would ever interact would be in a servant master kind of situation. But the war changed that as well, because suddenly, women were flocking to the hospitals to volunteer and they were bumping into each other, essentially. They were working alongside each other rather than for each other. And Peggy meets Gwen, who is actually a student at Somerville College, the college she would love to be a student at. And they strike up a really interesting relationship, though it's not always smooth sailing. She was a character I just really loved writing and really came to adore. But yeah, it really is a demonstration of, the class differences. There's not just gender that Peggy has to deal with. There is also class.
I really enjoyed their friendship.
Yeah, I did too. I thought it was a fun friendship, but hopefully also realistic sort of frictions in there.
Absolutely. One thing you did that I thought was totally fascinating, and I didn't completely connect it up till I got to the end of the book, and you wrote about it at the end, but each section is titled with a book that was actually published during this window of time from Oxford University Press. I loved that.
Thank you. Yeah, this was a sort of structure that I had in my head before I even started. And I think, again, it probably happened when I was in the archives that same time when I saw the woman gathering the pages. While I was there, I was also looking at certain books that had been published by Oxford University Press. And one in particular was called Shakespeare's England. And it is essentially 2 volumes of essays looking at what England was like during the time of Shakespeare. And there are about 30 or 40 contributors to these 2 volumes. And every single one of them is a man writing about some aspect of England at that time. And this book gets like a mention in one line in my previous novel, The Dictionary of Lost Words, because it was in the newspaper. People were frightened that Shakespeare's England was actually going to be delayed. The publication would be delayed and it wouldn't make publication in time for Shakespeare's, the anniversary of Shakespeare's death, which was very important, which was April 1916. And so that's when it was supposed to be published. And there was something in the paper about how the war was slowing down the production of this book. And that just gets a line in my previous book. But because I was looking at this volume, that's when I got the idea that, well, the people who were actually making this book are the people that I was interested in writing about. And suddenly I had a structure that I thought would be interesting, at least to me. And you know, if you're going to be spending 3 years on a novel, you have to be interested in it. So you have to find things that are going to keep you going. And so I was really interested to find out, well, what are the books that my characters would have been binding at the time? And so when I wrote the book, I was very careful to include real books that were being bound at the time my characters were were enacting the work. And I came across some amazing books. And what happened was, as I came across the books that were being bound at the time, I would engage with them to a small or medium extent, just like my character Peggy would be engaging with them as she folds their pages or gathers their sections. I would read snippets just like she would read snippets. And every now and then I'd read something that would make me want to spend more time with that book or that text. And they're the books that became important to Peggy because they had become important to me, because they said something about the times that Peggy was living through. They were a reflection in a way, or they allowed Peggy to reflect on something. And so these books then became the headings of there's 5 sections in the novel, and they become the headings or the sort of guiding book for each section of the novel.
I loved that. Now we're going to get to one of my favorite things to chat about, and that is covers. And your cover will definitely be one of my favorite of the year. I just think it is stunning. And it's a little different than the Australia and New Zealand one. So I just wanted to talk with you a little bit about your covers and what you thought about them and the whole process for coming up with them.
Yeah, covers are fascinating, aren't they? And I am a sucker for a cover. So I know how important they are, even though I know that there's so many people behind the design of a cover and they are all thinking, how are we going to get a reader in? I know it's like an advertisement, but I still, because I'm such a tactile book person, I do love the real thing. I love to hold it. I love to feel it. And covers these days aren't just, they're not just colour and image. You can feel the design very often. You can feel a kind of slightly softer part of in terms of texture, and then sometimes there's a little bit that glitters, or there's a little bit that is smooth and shiny. And I really love the feel of covers as well as the look. But this cover I really love. The books in particular are so kind of, I suppose, resonant of the story. Books are really what the story is all about. It's all about access to books and knowledge. And I love how the designer has really, built the cover around the books.
But with the beautiful backdrop as well. And then it ties in so well to the Dictionary of Lost Words. It's a great marketing technique, but as well as that, it's also just so cool because you pull up one book, you pull up the other, they go together, but they're different enough looking that they're separate books. It's just very cool the way they do that.
Yeah, I completely agree. There is something, particularly because these books are companion books. And it's not, there's a series of books where, it's got the same author. And so the books all have a similar style because it's got the same author. But in this case, the books there's something that links them together. It's like they have the same DNA. You can tell they're part of the same family, but you can absolutely tell them apart as well. And I really enjoy how designers do that. And they are doing, there's something tricksy about it, isn't there? Because what they're doing, I suppose, is with the new cover, they're reminding you of the other book, but they're still putting this book front and center.
I think your sibling reference is perfect. They're part of the same family, but they're not twins.
Yeah. And it's a good reference too, because Bookbinder is all about twins and sisters.
I was just thinking that. I was like, and that really ties in well. And it's called the Bookbinder of Jericho in Australia and New Zealand. Do you know why they decided to include the of Jericho over there, but here they decided just to do the Bookbinder?
Yeah, so the original title is the Bookbinder of Jericho, because Jericho is the name of the neighbourhood where Oxford University Press is.
Right.
And it's where the characters live. So they're from Jericho. But obviously Jericho is also the name of a place in the Middle East, which I think for some places is a little bit more confusing than it is in others. So in the UK, they are more familiar with Jericho as a neighbourhood of Oxford. And in Australia, it seemed to work. So some places are changing the Jericho reference either to Oxford and others are just dropping it. So, yeah. So, every territory that a book is published has its particular understandings of the world that sometimes titles have to change in order to hit the right tone.
That's a very valid point. And I can understand that in the US, keeping it the Bookbinder.
Yeah.
So the title in the UK and Australia is the same, and it's different here. Is the cover in the UK the same as the Australian cover?
No. So very similarly, I suppose these are all marketing decisions, aren't they, in the end? So the cover in the UK is incredibly different. So Australia and the US, the covers, I suppose, they are similar. They have a similar DNA. But the cover in the UK is a kind of sky blue, and it has a narrowboat on the front cover and the twin sisters standing at the front of the narrowboat. So it's a gorgeous cover as well, but a very different type of cover. And in many ways, I suppose it makes sense because the canals and narrowboats are a very common feature of England, as they would be of other places in Europe, but they're not so common in Australia or the US. We don't have a canal system in either of our countries, I don't think, or narrowboats. And so that image wouldn't be quite so familiar. But in England, it's definitely familiar. And so that's what they were trying to conjure.
Okay, I'm going to have to look that one up because I have not seen it. I've seen the Australian and I've obviously seen ours, and they are very similar. But I'm going to have to look up the UK one.
Absolutely. It's so different. It's very different.
That must be such a fun thing when you have these books coming out all these different places and to just line all the covers up for each place and see how different or similar they are.
It is. It's really interesting. And then to do what we're doing now and try to figure out, why did one country have this cover and another country have that cover? And try to sort of understand some of the cultural differences that lead to these decisions. And these decisions are always decisions of the publisher. The writer rarely has much input into covers, though we're always kind of consulted. We don't have the final say.
Right. Sometimes a cover will be selected. It'll get all the way down to the sales department and they'll be like, oh, no, thank you. And then it goes back and starts over. So the whole cover process is fascinating. And then to talk about all the different territories is even more fascinating. So they clearly know what they're doing because it's their job, but it is interesting to try to dissect it all.
Yeah, that's right. And it's nice to be involved in terms of, just a final kind of comment. But I also like that these are people who do know what they're doing. They have certain expertise that I don't. So I'm very glad they don't leave it in my hands.
Can you imagine? You'd be like, here's what I've come up with.
I know. And then I'd have to live with the consequences.
Exactly. You're like, is there no one that can help me? Well, before we wrap up, I would love to hear what you've read recently that you really liked.
Oh, yeah. So I'm a big reader. I'm a very, very slow reader. So I listen to a lot of books and read books at the same time. So I've usually got a couple on the go. But recently I have read a few books that I thought I'd share. One is Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan. She's an Irish writer. She writes short stories and novellas, really, I suppose. And she's an exquisite writer. Her writing is really, really exquisite, very powerful. It packs a punch for so few pages. So Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan. The other book that I had so much fun with was The Seven Moons of Maali Almeida by Shehan Karunatilaka. He won the Booker Prize for this and I adored it. I listened to it and I would recommend listening to it because there are a lot of Sri Lankan names in there that if I was reading it, I possibly, dreadfully, would sort of skim over some words that I would find difficult to pronounce. But listening to it, I think you just get the full impact of the beautiful language of the writer and all of the wonderful words and names that are part of the story. It's quite challenging in many ways, but it's a ghost story. It's about some pretty heavy topics, but the way it's written makes it very accessible, and I just loved it. And the other one I'd recommend is Horse by Geraldine Brooks. So Geraldine Brooks is an Australian writer, but she lives in the US, and I adore her writing. She writes a lot of historical fiction, and Horse is her latest book, and it's really fabulous. Totally recommend it.
I loved Horse, and I got to interview Geraldine Brooks about it. So that was just so exciting. And another fascinating thing about the horse, Lexington, that's the source of Horse, is that there's a nonfiction book coming out this week in the US about that same horse. And they both were working on it for about the same period of time, without realizing that each one was writing about Lexington. And so Geraldine Brooks has blurbed it. And I've interviewed Kim about Lexington, and it was just so interesting. And there's such a great pairing with the nonfiction story about Lexington and then Geraldine Brooks' historical fiction about it.
Oh, how fabulous.
Yeah, kind of fun to have it come at it from two ways.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. And I think for readers, it's wonderful when that serendipity happens. Something that I always recommend, whenever I talk about my first book, The Dictionary of Lost Words, when people say, how did you get the idea for it? I always mention Simon Winchester's book, The Professor and the Madman. It's called The Surgeon of Crowthorne in Australia and the UK. So there's another example of a book changing its title. But it's called The Professor and the Madman in the US. And it's a non-fiction book about the editor of the Oxford English Dictionary and one of the people who sent in words with examples of how they'd been used. Very, very interesting. And that was the kind of kickstart to my novel. And I love that a reader can kind of read a fiction, but then also go back and read a non-fiction about the same topic. And they just get a much deeper understanding of, a time in history. And I think it's wonderful. So I love that. I love knowing that there's this book about Lexington. That's terrific.
I think that is so fun to pair books together like that. I have a Patreon community for my podcast, and one of the new series that I've launched is fiction and nonfiction pairings, and I do 2 sets of books a month. And it's just so much fun to even find those connections and then to get to talk about them, because I think people really do like reading the fictional story. Usually it's more fast-paced, there's an actual story, and then pairing it with the nonfiction where you're getting some of the details that you wouldn't necessarily get in the fictional accounting.
I totally agree. And as we're talking, I'm trying to think, I wonder what the nonfiction pairing would be for the Bookbinder. I'd love you if you have people who you connect with online. It would be so great to see if anyone can come up with a nonfiction pairing. I'd love to know what it would be.
Or maybe I'll find one and I'll do it as part of my Patreon series and then also share it with you. And on Claire Keegan, I have small things like these on my bedside table, but I read Foster last fall and I loved it. Have you read her book, Foster?
I haven't, but I was just today, I've written it down on my to-do list. I'm going to go to the bookshop and have a look at what's on offer from her, because I really want to read more of her work. Her short stories also are just extraordinary. And so, I want to read a little bit more. I think she's the sort of writer who can teach you how to write.
Well, and she just does like you do in this book, where she so vividly brings the characters to life that you feel like you're right there with them. It's another book that I just continue to think about. And those end up being my favorite types of books when months later, I'm still thinking about them.
Yes, I agree. I think we would probably have a very similar taste in reading.
I think that's right. Well, I've absolutely loved chatting with you, Pip. Thank you for taking the time to come on the Thoughts from a Page podcast.
Cindy, it's been such a pleasure. And thank you so much for inviting me.
I'm Allison Holland, host of the Kennedy Dynasty podcast. Equipped with a microphone and a long-term fascination of the Kennedy family, I am joined by an incredible cast of experts, friends, and guests to take you on a fun, relaxed, yet informative journey through history and pop culture. From book references to fashion to philanthropy to our modern expectations of the presidency itself, you'll see that there is so much more to Kennedy than just JFK or conspiracy theories. Join me for the Kennedy Dynasty podcast.
Thank you so much for listening to my podcast. I would love to connect with you on Instagram or Facebook, where you can find me at Thoughts from a Page. If you enjoy the show, please consider joining my Patreon group to access bonus content and support the podcast. If you have a moment to rate the show or subscribe to it wherever you listen to your podcasts, I would really appreciate it. It makes a big difference. And please tell all of your friends about Thoughts from a Page. Word of mouth does wonders to help the show grow. The book discussed in this episode can be purchased at my bookshop storefront, and the link is in the show notes. I hope you'll tune in next time.
Coming up on 5 Minute News, I'm Anthony Davis. You might think it's partisan because maybe it's critical of one side or the other, but it's not. It's just the truth. And I think that's also something that's kind of unusual for Americans listening to the radio or to podcasts, because The news landscape in the States has been so partisan for so many decades, so 5 Minute News is verified, truthful, independent, unbiased, and essential world news daily.